Park rangers share their creepiest experience while on the job. A stranger watching in the distance. Middle school can be scary enough, and a field trip in the mountains, and you got yourself a setup for the possibilities of a horror movie. What do you think this park ranger may have been witnessing? A creep, a ghost, or a guardian angel? I once led a trip of middle school kids to the top of Mount Sterling. At night the kids and the other co-instructor went to bed in their tents. I chose to spend the night in a hammock. I laid there enjoying the scenery and noticed something moving on the trail. As I got closer, I could tell it was a person. We were in the middle of nowhere, and there was someone hiking up the trail with no headlight. But when they arrived at the top of the mountain and just stopped, I watched as what appeared to be a man survey our camp. He stood there for what seemed like 30 minutes, then turned and sat down under a tree, staring at our camp. I just stared at the man while he stared at my camp. This went on until 3:30 a.m. Then he stood up, took a moment to survey my camp for a few minutes longer, and then went back down the trail from which they came. An abandoned shed that used to be a cell. Talk about creepy. Stumbling across an old shed is one thing, but this Reddit user stumbled across a bit more than that. A shed behind an abandoned house with a steel reinforced door broken off the hinges. The windows of the shed were boarded up from the outside. The only thing inside the shed was a queen-size bed with shredded partly synced white sheets. A severed deer head on the trail. Can you explain this? As a ranger, I'm sure he has seen his share of dead animals mangled, bloody, half-eaten by vultures would be the norm. But this find doesn't fit any of those profiles. Park ranger Hippopotamus rex is left to wonder. I'm a ranger at Yellowstone. I was exploring the Lamar Valley, about 11 miles from the nearest road. There in the middle of the trail is a perfectly severed deer head. No blood, no raggedness at the severance. This is a weird thing, because I have seen wolf and bear kills, but this was not any of those things. The head was completely uneaten, eyes, tongue, everything intact. Even the ravens hadn't touched it yet. Even a human doing it made no conventional sense whatsoever. It was a doe, so it had no antlers. Plus, why leave it in the trail? On Splash. This story is sure to give you chills, knowing that history is buried, or not buried, right below our feet, could really set you on edge at work every day. How much could you stumble across before being totally freaked out? For several years, I worked out in the forest of a country that experienced a genocide in the not credibly distant past. Several times I found skulls. Once I wasn't watching where I was walking. I stumbled into something soft. I looked down, and it looked like it was an old sweater that had been lying there forever. I poked it with my foot and dug around in the vegetation a bit. And sure enough, most of the skeleton was gone, but it was clear there were bones inside the sweater. Somehow, that freaked me out more than the skull. 2 years ago, another ranger and myself find a giant pentagram in a small clearing of the trees strewn on the ground, 20 feet in diameter. Most of the trees surrounding it were locust and had black beads hanging from the thorns. We found it at night too, but clearly whatever took place was several days prior. Fast forward to last night. We see a car parked at the dead end of the road near the area. I figure it's just people fishing, but we decide to go check to make sure it's not an illegal campsite. Well, we get down there and we can't find them, So we start walking towards the shoreline and stumble upon two women sitting inside another pentagram holding hands and chanting something. They had a blanket down and a bunch of books. There were also a piece of driftwood in it, where they made an altar out of various fruits and leaves. We made contact with them, and they kept insisting it looked weird, but they were just messing around. Mid-convo, the woman grabs this green canvas back and keep clutching it while I try to figure out what exactly they're doing. I was pretty creeped out, but kinda decided they were just weirdos and ultimately weren't harming anything. They admitted that they had been there before at the site, and the site that we had found 2 years ago was them. Told them to make sure they don't leave anything behind this time, and left. Still unsure what the fuck they were doing. We figured it must have been some shit related to the eclipse last night, but who knows. Found a truck that was seemingly abandoned past our 14-day limit in one of the primitive campgrounds. Every time I would drive by the hood and the front doors, they were all open, all the way. One day I decided to check on it to see if we need to start towing it. When a guy I couldn't see pops out from the front seat as soon as I get close, scaring the living crap out of me. He wasn't wearing anything but shorts and seemed a bit off. He claimed that he was waiting for someone to come and help fix the truck. I just let him have it, and I'm going to see if he's still there in another week or so. Then another time, I was walking a boundary line, checking for encroachment and mostly killing time. And I kept seeing papers taped to trees with crosses drawn on them. I figured someone just target shooting. Oh, they're not allowed, but oh well. And then I started seeing Blair Witch or Slender Man stuff drawn on an abandoned building on private property. I know it's just some kids being weird, but I never walked, or maybe ran, a boundary line quicker after seeing that. So this just happened the past 2 weeks. 2 weeks ago, we got a report of a raccoon tail and entrails on the trail. Something we have never heard of before. So we went down there, and right where the fork in the trail is, the only place that everyone would see, there's a pile of intestines in the middle of the left trail, and a severed raccoon tail in the middle of the right trail. Once we looked ahead, we found a raccoon head right in the start of the fork, staring straight out to the entrance. There was no blood, no bones, no anything, just those parts. We went down a little bit and found a rock that had a bit of thrash near it. Very unusual for our trail. It was a perfect rock to be able to sit on and to be able to see the entrance of the trail without anyone seeing you. Right in the front of the rock was a skeleton. So at least we found the rest of the raccoon, right? Wrong. This skeleton had its head intact and its fur in a pile next to it. Different animal. We have had rangers on this site for years who have never seen a dead animal anywhere close to the trail. We just found 2. Since then, some weird things have popped up. One in particular was a knife thrown into the middle of an overgrown area on the trail. The other of which looks like some type of pentagram logo drawn into the ground with a small square and triangle in it. We still have no clue why it was there. I worked at a national park for about 4 months when I really needed money. It was a big group of lakes and a few caves. I'm going to describe it like that since I'm not okay with saying the real location. 2 months in, and another cave entrance was discovered. I don't mean a big cave, but a small water cave, knee deep. When I hear about it, I went to go check it out. It was pretty boring, but the next day, a few workers came to add a path to the location. They discovered a body of a man in his 40s. He fell from a cliff that is a popular photo area. Was probably alone on the trip. Nobody noticed. I didn't see any of it. But I heard that he completely decomposed and there was just some bones left. My brother is a national park ranger. He only had one weird experience in Big Bend National Park. He and his roommate had the exact same dream, where they were chased through the mountains by a large black bull. Turns out the canyon he was staying in is haunted by a witch that takes the form of a bull. It's called the Bruyas Canyon or something. Google it, I guess. He says a lot of weird shit happens in the Southwest though. And he and his fellow rangers who have worked in the NPS for a while have some good stories. One season he was working at Arches in Utah, and his fellow ranger had taken a kayaking trip somewhere in the area of Utah. One night, while sleeping on the banks of the river, she had a very vivid dream of someone walking in the water outside her tent. She went outside to check, and there was a naked woman in the river. This woman then jumped on his friend and started choking her so violently that when she woke up, she was still seriously gasping for her breath. The next morning, she checked outside the tent, and there were cougar tracks everywhere. She talked to a native friend about it, and turns out skinwalkers will turn into cougars and hang out in that section of the river. Apparently, she's lucky to be alive. My brother said the fear of skinwalkers is so alive in those native communities that when he would visit schools to give talks, he would have to refrain from talking about certain animals because they're commonly associated with skinwalkers. Owls and cougars, apparently. He also said that there's quite a few NPS rangers that believe in Bigfoot. Not that he's a real ape, but some kind of forest spirit. We went camping at Crater Lake in Oregon, and where we camped, it was heavily wooded, and there were about 2 or 3 other people besides us. We get there around midday, and we set up and relax. By now, it begins to get dark, so we decide to cook some food, call it a day after we eat. Now me, my cousin, and my brother shared a tent to sleep in. So I'd say around 2 or 3 a.m. rolls around, and I have to pee like a motherfucker. Anyways, I do my stuff and head back to the tent to find the zipper wide open, and my little brother's gone. So I start freaking out, and I wake my cousin up to tell him what happened. And essentially, we searched until about sunrise, and then we called the rangers. They searched for about 4 or 5 hours, and they find him 10 miles away from our campsite, and he has no clue how we got there. All he has on is his underwear and nothing else. Now, after this whole ordeal, our cousin tells us about David Paulides and his whole research on missing people in the national parks. Needless to say, it was the most jarring and disturbing thing that I ever had happened to me in my life. It really, in all honesty, ruined camping for us all. And I had loved camping too. But needless to say, Crater Lake is the place to go for some creepy paranormal shit. Not SAR or elite hiker by any means, but my 2 stories, and I will post the reveals because they are honestly mundane. A few years back, with a large group of scouts in Botany, SP, we were hiking for some godforsaken dense forest trail. in the wet Californian winter nights. The first night, the raccoons rolled a bunch of our bear containers down a gully into a creek. We were able to find them. The second day, we encountered a road and a checkpoint. The guard booth was abandoned. There were no signs, but we concluded that it was an abandoned prison. The adults would have gone in there, but we didn't want to endanger the kids, so we hiked on. Later that night, right around 1 a.m., I was awakened by the sound of gunfire. It was about 100 plus yards away, and it was not pistols. It was some very loud, sharp puppy guns, different guns. It started off slow, and then after a dozen or so, a pause, then more. Then it was steady for maybe 100 plus or more from several different guns. Then, when the other guns stopped, the loudest one kept firing, and it wasn't a full auto, but a lot of rapid fired shots. I never got to count the magazine between the reloads, but this went on for about 20 minutes in total, then just stopped. I got out of my sleeping bag out of our tent and hiked the 30 yards through the bush to the other campsite in the dark without my light on. I didn't want anyone else to see me. I got to the campsite and the kids were all still asleep, but the other adults had heard it. I had no idea what it was. Maybe pot farmers in a gunfight with intruders. Next morning, it was a topic of conversation, but most of the kids had actually slept through it. After we left and got home, we talked to the ranger, and they said that sometimes people break into the prison and use the old gun range. My other story was camping in Big Sur, Silver Peak. I was alone, but only about 5 miles from the road. I just finished dinner and lay down to sleep. After a few minutes, I heard kind of a crunch, 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 crunch sound that sounded like footsteps outside. I moved my head to try to figure out what direction it was coming from, and they stopped. I put my head back down, and a few minutes later, they started again. Crunch, 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 again. I lifted my head to see the direction they were coming from, or whether it was close. Nothing. This cycle repeated for a couple of times, until I decided to turn over and open my tent flap to get a look around outside with the flashlight. I was expecting to see a person out there walking around in the dark, but I saw nothing, heard nothing. Sipped up, put my head back down, and tried to go to sleep. Again, crunch, 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 crunch. Again, lifted my head, I stopped. I tried to readjust. I looked outside again. I couldn't find the source. It certainly wasn't my heart, because I was thumping like mad. This kept me awake for hours that evening. I was terrified that there was someone out there or something who had heard me move my head and stop walking, only to continue when they thought I had fallen back to sleep. Maybe past midnight, but eventually I fell asleep. Next morning I had breakfast, broke camp, and as I set up my tent, I noticed that my head had been resting right above a gopher hole. This one is pretty tame. I almost always camp out, way out. I'm talking 30 to 40 miles down untamed and unnamed dirt roads, up mountains and canyons, etc. A couple of years ago, I was camping alone out on a prairie flat, halfway surrounded by forest. It's nearly winter, and there's not a soul within 50 miles, I bet. A big hound dog was with me, as always. It was cold, like below freezing, so I had a roaring campfire going. Jake the dog was in and out. He wandered off for a while, got cold and came back for attention and warmth. He has a bell around his collar, so I can know where he is. I'm drinking beer and listening to music, so I'm not paying much attention to his whereabouts. Mind you, it's pitch black out there, other than the stars. So after 20 minutes, I hadn't seen Jake, so I call him. Nothing. Turn off the music and call louder. Nothing for about 5 minutes. I hear his bell, so I'm relieved. I heard his bell behind me, which was odd. The 3-line was in front of me, where he had been sniffing around earlier. Thinking he was nearby, I relaxed and refocused on chopping some more wood. I could faintly hear his bell jingling behind me still. Sometimes closer, sometimes further. And I figured he was just doing the hound dog's job and smelling all around. I'd say about 40 minutes goes by, and I hadn't heard his bell or seen him. So I call him again, and I get up to walk towards the 3-line. Big dark forest of ponderosa pine looms in front of me. I shine my fairly bright flashlight around into the trees. Nothing, no sound, no sight. I'm starting to get nervous, getting the willies, whatever you want to call it. I hear some crunches in the woods, like sticks and stuff breaking. Not knowing where my dog is, or much of anything other than, okay, I'm going back to the fire where my shotgun is. I get back to my truck and my fire when I hear absolute panic barking from the direction in front of me, from the tree line. Tearing across the field is my dog at full tilt. You could never mistake a hound dog's panic bark from a bay or a yip or whatever else. It was unlike anything. He ran behind me for a moment, and then underneath my truck. Here's the creepy part. No bell. He had his collar on, and the bell was clipped to it with a carabiner. Sure as shit, I put us both in the cab of the truck for the rest of the frozen night. To this day, I still have no clue who or what was wearing that bell behind me for a few hours on a rural prairie flat in the winter. One of the scariest things I've had ever happened to me involved a search and rescue for a young woman who'd gotten separated from a hiking group. We were out until late night because the dog had picked up a scent. We found her. She was curled all up under a large rotted log. She was missing her shoes and pack and was clearly in shock. She didn't have any injuries, and we were able to get her to walk back with us to the base ops. Along the way, she kept looking behind us and asking us why that big man with black eyes was following us. We couldn't see anyone, so we wrote it off as some weird symptom of shock. But the closer we got to base, the more agitated this woman got. She kept asking me to tell him to stop making faces at her. At one point, she stopped and turned around and started to yell into the forest, saying that she wanted him to leave her alone. She wasn't going with him, she said, and she wouldn't give us to him. We finally got her to keep moving, but we started hearing weird noises coming from all around us. It was almost like coughing, but more rhythmic and deeper. It was almost insect-like. I don't really know how else to describe it. When we were within the sight of base ops, the woman turns to me, and her eyes are about as wide as I can imagine a human could open them. She touches my shoulder and says, "He says to tell you to speed up. He doesn't like looking at your scar at the neck." I have a very small scar on the base of my neck, but it's almost hidden under my collar. And I have no idea how this woman saw it. Right after she says it, I hear that weird coughing right in my ear, and I just about jumped out of my skin. I hustled her to the ops, trying not to show how freaked out I was, but I have to say that I was really happy when we left that area that night. This is probably the weirdest story that I have. Now, I don't know if it's true in every SAR unit, but in mine, it's sort of an unspoken regular thing we run into. You could try asking about it with other SAR officers, but even if they know what you're talking about, they probably won't say anything about it. We've been told not to talk about it by our superiors, and at this point, we've all gotten so used to it that it doesn't even seem weird anymore. On just about every case where we're really far into the wilderness, I'm talking about 30 to 40 miles, at some point, we'll find a staircase in the middle of the woods. It's almost like you took the stairs out of your house, cut them out, and put them in the forest. I asked about it first time I saw some, and the other officer just told me not to worry about it, that it was normal. Everyone I asked said the same thing. I wanted to go check them out, but I was told never to go anywhere near them. I just sort of ignore them now when I run into them, because it happens so frequently. I'm a search and rescue officer for US Forest Service. I have some stories to tell. I wasn't sure where to post these stories, so I figured out I'd share them here. I've been an SAR officer for a few years now, and along the way I've seen some things that I think you guys will be interested in. I have a pretty good track record for finding missing people. Most of the time they just wander off the path or slip down a small cliff and they can't find their way back. The majority of them have heard the old say, stay where you are thing, and don't wander off. But I've had 2 cases where that didn't happen. Both bother me a lot, and I used them as motivation to search even harder on the missing persons cases I get called on. The first was a little boy who was out berry picking with his parents. He and his sister were together. Both of them went missing around the same time. Their parents lost sight of them for a few seconds, and in that time the kids apparently wandered off. When their parents couldn't find them, they called us, and we came out to search the area. We found the daughter pretty quickly, and when we asked her where the brother was, she told us that he had been taken away by the bear man. She said he gave her berries and told her to stay quiet, and wanted to play with her brother for a while. The last she saw of her brother, he was riding on the shoulders of the bear man and seemed calm. Of course, our first thought was abduction, but we never found a trace of another human in that area. The little girl was also insistent that he wasn't a normal man, but he was tall and covered in hair, like a bear, and that he had a weird face. We searched the area for weeks. It was one of the longest calls I've ever been on, but we never found a single trace of that kid. The other was a young woman who was out hiking with her mom and grandpa. According to the mother, her daughter had climbed up to a tree to get a better view of the forest, and she'd never come back down. They waited at the base of the tree for hours, calling her name, before they called for help. Again, we searched everywhere, and we never found a trace of her. I have no idea where she could have possibly gone, because neither her mom or grandpa saw her come down. A few times I've been out on my own searching with a canine, and they've tried to lead me straight up cliffs. Not hills, not even rock faces, straight sheer cliffs with no possible handholds. It's always baffling, and in those cases we usually find a person on the other side of the cliff, or miles away from where the canine has led us. I'm sure there's an explanation, but it's sort of strange. One particular sad case involved the recovery of a body. A 9-year-old girl fell down an embankment and got impaled on a tree at the base. A dead tree. It was a complete freak accident, but I'll never forget the sound of her mother, the sound she made when we told her what had happened. She saw the body bag being loaded into the ambulance, and she let out the most haunting, heartbroken wail I've ever heard. It was like her whole life was crashing down around her, and part of her had died with her daughter. I heard from another SAR officer that she killed herself a few weeks after it had happened. She couldn't live with the loss of her daughter. I was teamed up with another SAR officer because we received reports of a bear in the area. We were looking for a guy who hadn't come home from a climbing trip when he was supposed to, and we ended having up some serious climbing to get to where we figured out he'd be. We found him trapped in a small crevice with a broken leg. It was not pleasant. He had been there for almost 2 days, and his leg was obviously infected. We were able to get him into a chopper, and I heard from one of the EMTs that the guy was absolutely inconsolable. He kept talking about how he'd been doing fine, and when he's gotten up to the top, a man had been there. He said that the guy had no climbing equipment, and he was wearing a parka and ski pants. He walked up to the guy, and when the guy turned around, he said he had no face. It was just blank. He freaked out and ended up trying to get off the mountain too fast, which is why he had fallen. He said he could hear the guy all night climbing down the mountain and letting off these horrible muffled screams. That story bothered the hell out of me. I'm glad I wasn't there to hear it.